Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you all to the first webinar of 2023 hosted by the NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence on Achieving the Tobacco Endgame. My name is Shaniel Polyevich and I'm a research fellow within the CRE. I'd like to begin our webinar by acknowledging the traditional owners. I recognise that people are joining from various locations across Australia and Aotearoa, but for those of us based in Meanjin or Brisbane, I acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people as the traditional owners and their custodianship of the unceded lands on which we meet today. I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So we're very pleased today to have Associate Professor Natalie Walker join us to present today's webinar. Natalie is a public health researcher, clinical trialist, and leader of the Addiction Research Program at the National Institute for Health Innovation at the University of Auckland. She's also the Associate Director of the Centre for Addiction Research within the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at the University of Auckland. Her primary area of interest is the conduct of phase 3 community-based pragmatic trials, particularly in smoking cessation. And that's what she'll be speaking about today. So today, Natalie will be speaking on research with impact, the evolution of research on e-cigarettes and cytisine for smoking cessation in New Zealand. Thank you very much for your time today, Natalie, and over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's wonderful to be able to speak to everyone today. My first webinar of the year. And it's all been very dramatic in New Zealand with our cyclone and our floods. And I would just like to acknowledge friends, family. A lot of people in New Zealand have been impacted. And I hope any New Zealanders on this call, on this video, are well and safe. And I send you lots of good hugs because it's been a very difficult time for us. So without further ado, I will talk to you about some of the research that we've been conducting at the University of Auckland, particularly in the group that I work with, which is the National Institute for Health Innovation. We used to be called the Clinical Trials Research Unit, and we have morphed into this institute, but we specialise in interventions around risk factors for non-communicable diseases, and I specifically specialise in pragmatic clinical trials. Right, so first of all, just to set the scene a little bit for our Australian audience, our New Zealand audience probably will know this, but here is some data from our New Zealand Health Survey, our most recent data on smoking rates. So for current smoking, which will include your non-daily smokers, we have currently a prevalence of 9.2%. And that is, over the last 11 years, is basically a halving in our smoking prevalence, which is incredibly good news. And that decrease has been happening across all subgroups, except for those who are 75 years and older and in the Pacific population. If we look at some of the subgroups, you can see that according to neighbourhood deprivation, so quintile 1 is the least deprived and the quintile 5 are the most deprived neighbourhoods. You can see there is clear differences in smoking prevalence, so much higher in our quintile 5. And also there are differences according to ethnicity. So Māori and Pacifica are higher, but I would just like to remind you that these prevalence rates have still been decreasing over time. So not to forget the good news is that there has been that decrease. We have slightly higher rates of smoking in men than women, and our highest smoking age group is 25 to 34 and 45 to 64. And recently we've had extra data available to us through the survey around looking at disabled versus non-disabled populations, and you can see there's almost a doubling in smoking prevalence in the disabled population. So with that knowledge in mind, when we first started working in the tobacco space, which was around 2005, I think, as smoking tobacco is a leading risk factor for heart disease and cancers, non-communicable diseases. We we're thinking about, well, how can we have an impact? How can we really make a difference, particularly into those populations or subgroups of the population where, you know, the rates of smoking is still quite high? What do we want to do in this field? Previously, we had been working in heart disease and clinical trials around cardiovascular disease, but we switched into the risk factor focus, mainly because smoking cessation is one of the most cost-effective interventions that we have on hand. So because we specialize in clinical trials, and we look at all types of trials, so not just your parallel group trials, but cluster trials, factorials, stepped wedge, all sorts of different types of designs, and you choose the design depending on the question. We really wanted to make sure that our research made a difference. And this picture here gives you an example of how you might frame your study. You know, are you looking at efficacy or are you looking at effectiveness? And your trial might sit somewhere along the spectrum. So efficacy is a very tightly controlled study. So an example would be you might have a clinic, people come into the clinic, you pay them to turn up, you take some bloods, you do lots of measurements, there's no missing data, you watch them take their medicine, you have full, you know, everything is very controlled. You might only have, you might exclude people that have any sort of mental health concerns or are using other drugs of addiction. And so it means that you've got a very nice, clean clinical trial. But the issue is the findings from that trial don't actually match the population that you're trying to reach. And so you imagine a doctor sitting and, you know, a GP sitting with a patient in front of them, and he's going, well, the only clinical trial for this medicine is on men who are reasonably healthy and they're all European. And the person sitting across from me is a woman and she is not European and she has multiple other health conditions. So how do I know if that medicine is okay for her? And so that's why we try and move towards the more pragmatic side, which is looking at effectiveness. So in the real world, people don't get paid to take their medicine. They have to physically sometimes go to a pharmacy to pick up their medicine or a GP to get a prescription. And so, you know, we want to know what's the effectiveness of a medicine or an intervention in that population, and that includes everyone. So the trials we chose, we don't exclude people unless there's a clear contraindication to exclude them. So, and we also don't pay our participants. So sometimes payment can be an incentive in itself, particularly in the smoking cessation field. So this is where we'd like to position ourselves. So when we first started working in this area, cell phones were just coming in, and text messages actually specifically were just coming in. So the first thing we did, because we quite like novel things, devices particularly, anything new that sort of gets our interest, we thought, what could we do with this text message thing? This is interesting. And so one of our first trials was the STOMP trial, which was just a basic text messaging program. And you'll see that we have national recruitment. We just use multimedia advertising to direct people to come and enroll in the study. So that was our first big study. And then the next 4 big trials we did, again, sometimes always national recruitment, we used the quit line to help recruit. And we actually seconded staff off the quit line to directly help us collect our data. It was a nice partnership. And these trials were designed to increase uptake of existing medications for smoking cessation. So, you know, how do we know NRT works if it's used well, so how do we get more uptake of that? So we also looked at one with exercise. And so, as you can see, the sample sizes are very large. This is because because they're pragmatic, we know, the quit rates are usually much lower in the community, so that's why the sample size is much bigger. And so, yeah, these are big studies to run, and will take usually 3 to 4 years to get through the process of recruitment and follow-up. One study I will point out is a nicotine reduction study where we had nicotine-free cigarettes available as an intervention plus usual care versus usual quit-lung care, which in New Zealand is combination NRT and behavioural support. At this point, Murray Lorgeson, who's a very famous researcher in New Zealand, a medical doctor, amazing man who has a visionary with a lot of his impact on tobacco control policy and other areas. But he said, you know, what say we tried this sort of idea of these cigarettes? What would happen? You know, it's just asking questions about really pushing the boundaries about what would happen if we took the nicotine out of the cigarettes? Would that help people switch away from them completely? So this was quite a pivotal trial for New Zealand's current new policy on nicotine reduction. But see, it was undertaken almost 10 years ago, and that policy is just coming in now. So a big shout out to Murray, who's probably in his 90s now. So Murray also sort of introduced us to the first e-cigarettes that came about, which is the first one on the left here. It's the first generation e-cigarette. He says, hey, look at this. What do you think we could do with this? What is it? What's it doing? How is it delivering nicotine? We should look at this. And so we started some initial research. Again, you know, how does this help people quit smoking? And so our first trial has looked at this type of device. Our second trial looked at this type of device. And then we're currently running our latest trial, which is the 4th generation. The problem with running trials, as I've already told you, can take 2 to 5 years. Plus you have to wait to get the funding, which in New Zealand takes about a year. You know, and meanwhile, these devices have just rapidly evolved, so you can't even keep up with the technology changes. So, you know, quite difficult. So just a second. Yeah, so that was just frozen. There we go. So when we first looked at e-cigarettes, we thought, okay, this thing delivers nicotine apparently. So it's sort of like a nicotine replacement therapy, but we didn't really know how much nicotine it was delivering. So one of the first things we did was a little crossover study to see, well, is anything actually happening? And that's that first study shown there with Chris Bullen. Professor Chris Bullen led that one. And so this crossover trial also showed us that even the placebo e-cigarette, so e-cigarette with no nicotine in it, was still able to reduce people's desire to smoke, and actually helped address feelings of withdrawal. And there was a reduction in cigarette smoke per day. So this sort of highlighted to us there's actually something more going on with e-cigarettes than just the nicotine delivery. And in subsequent research with placebo inhalers and then also very low nicotine content cigarettes shows that hand-to-mouth association and action of hand-to-mouth with smoking is stronger for some people than others. The handling of the cigarettes is important and can actually have an impact on quitting over and above, you know, in addition to the nicotine that's delivered if you want to put the nicotine in as well. So we know that a lot of people that vape now don't even use nicotine in the devices. So we shouldn't always assume that there's nicotine in there. So this was interesting to us, and we're like, okay, this is we should really pay attention to what's the possibilities of reduced harm intervention for e-cigarettes. And so we did one of our first e-cigarette trials, this one here with the blue arrow, led by Chris Bullen. And at about the same time, an Italian group had also published a trial of e-cigarettes that came out very similar. One group was unmotivated to quit, and our ones were those that were motivated to quit. Again, pragmatic study, the New Zealand one, regional, Auckland and Waikato, I think, and we just used media advertising. Everyone got sent out a first generation device, and we told them to use them for 13 weeks. And then some people got a 0 nicotine e-cigarette, some people got just the NRT patch, and some got a 16 milligram e-cigarette. So these very first devices were a bit difficult. The batteries always played up a little bit, but we were able to see that there was a significant reduction in cigarettes per day. And then you could see that the quit rates were very low, as you would expect with a community-based study, because we're not able to absolutely ensure that people are using them every day. We just say, here's the device, use it to help you quit and see what happens. So the findings from these two trials were amalgamated in a Cochrane review in 2016, and they were the sum total contributing to this Cochrane review's findings. And you can see even way back in 2016 that there was some evidence that there was e-cigarettes were helping people to quit smoking if they had nicotine in compared to nicotine-free e-cigarettes. So these were important studies. And then over time, two more studies were published and contributed to the Cochrane review. And again, this was our second study in 2019, and at the same time, one came out from London. And so for a long time, there was only 4 studies in the Cochrane review that were having, helping governments make decisions about what should we do with e-cigarettes. And these 2 studies were looking at the second generation. So again, it takes time, a year to get the funding, and then 3 to 4 years or 2 to 5 years, depending on the sample size, to recruit everyone. Meanwhile, we've moved on from second generation. So again, you can see that there was an increase in a reduction, in the amount of cigarettes smoked per day, no difference in adverse events. And the second trial we did, which I led, was looking at combining a patch plus an e-cigarette. So it's a bit like if you had a patch and an NRT, a nicotine inhaler. So that concept of combination NRT treatment. The other thing to note in this slide is that the quit rates reflect the population. So the New Zealand trial is the general population, pragmatic, very light touch. Here's the product, just use it. Hopefully you use it. Some people won't. And then compared to a clinic-based service in England, so the quit rates were higher here, self-reported abstinence. Any questions as I'm going, or we're going to have questions at the end?
I think at the end.
Okay, sounds good. So here's the latest Cochrane review, which is a living review on e-cigarettes for smoking cessation. So as every time a new trial is published, it comes into the review. So currently they have 78 completed studies, 22,000 participants, and of the 78 studies, 40 are trials. Okay, so remember we started way back, more than 10 years ago. Of these 40 trials, only 10 were considered at low risk of bias. So these are the studies that, the 10 studies, actually only, so 9 studies contributing to the main comparisons. So there's 9 studies contributing to the evidence base for policymakers, for governments to make decisions about e-cigarettes for smoking cessation and informing treatment guidelines. Of these studies, you can see 6 contributed to the analysis around whether nicotine e-cigarettes are better than NRT, and 5 contributed to the nicotine e-cigarette versus a non-nicotine e-cigarette. All favourable, and 2 of our studies are still contributing to that. So we know that our studies have been designed to such a way to the lowest risk of bias possible, given it's a pragmatic study. We know that we have informed this review, but think about all the money spent on all those trials that didn't. And I guess my call is to you all is to, if you are doing clinical trials, try and think about how you can get them into these the Cochrane reviews, because they're super influential. And don't waste your money, don't waste people's times, but do the very best trial you can, because you know, it's taken 10 years and we've only got 6 studies influencing one outcome and 5 influencing another. The other thing I recommend is, which we do a lot, you know, ensure all our findings go back to our participants, but I immediately present the results to government policymakers in New Zealand before I publish. I say it's not peer reviewed yet, but here's the findings. So they can instantly see that outcome. If I recruit through Quitline, the Quitline gets that feedback, the research community through sort of standard processes there. Our trials, e-cigarette trials, have been picked up for other evidence reviews. And we know that our trials have influenced cessation treatment guidelines, not just in New Zealand, but also around the world. And then the information is also used in policy submissions around the world. So I know that we've made submissions to Australian government, for example, around vaping. And if anyone's interested in Australia, particularly, this is the New Zealand Vaping Facts website, which is the public-facing government's information about how we communicate reduced harm around vaping to our population. So those are our e-cigarette studies. So we've done a crossover and then 2 big trials. We've done some other small pieces of work, but we also have been working on cytisine. So cytisine is a plant-based alkaloid. It's found in quite a lot of plants around the world, but it's actually produced into tablets and capsules in Eastern Europe, and it's taken from a plant called the golden rain. So it's not synthesized in a laboratory, so it is plant-based. This plant, just by chance, happens to also grow in the southern parts of New Zealand, but it's not endemic. But we do know that a number of New Zealand endemic plants contain cytisine. So why are we interested in cytisine? Well, it's structurally similar to nicotine. It's a partial agonist at the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. It helps people manage the severity of their withdrawal, but it also blocks any reward if they do have a cigarette, so they just don't get that pleasure from it. So if that sounds very familiar, gosh, doesn't that just sound like something else you know about? Yes, it is. It's a very similar drug to varenicline. Potentially Pfizer might have taken cytisine and twiddled with it in the laboratory and turned it into varenicline. So slightly different dose and dosing between the 2 medications. One is, and there's been very little, when we first found out about cytisine, there was nothing published on how this dose and dosing came about. And so because most of the information was from Bulgaria and Poland and not published in English, so it was very difficult to find out a lot of information about cytisine at the first instance. The other reason we quite like cytisine is that it actually was very low cost. So even now it's sitting at about $20 to $30 for a 25-day course, except in Australia, which I'll talk about later. And so that's much more affordable than products like NIT and varenicline, although in New Zealand, NIT and varenicline are heavily subsidised by our government. There's a cost to the government for them, obviously. So well, okay, so it's plant-based, similar to varenicline, affordable, reasonably available in Eastern Europe. It's been on the market in 17 countries over in Europe, which are listed here, many since the 1960s, actually. And there's 3 sources at the moment. One's from Pharma in Bulgaria, another brand's from Poland, and one from Canada. So the Canadian one's more recent. The Canadian one is over the counter through a herbal pathway, and apparently it is approved in the UK, although I don't know much more than that. But in Australia is an interesting one. There are 3 companies that produce cytisine. So only 2 of them disclose that it's cytisine. And to be honest, the companies are profiteering, I believe, off this. So there's some loophole in the TGA system whereby this medication is available. From what I can see, it doesn't appear to be a license for use in Australia, but it is available. And the 3 companies charge a lot of money. The most is $650 for the 25-day course, compared to the $25 that I told you before. So that's concerning. But just to let you know, now the other company, which is not listed here, is Achieve Life Sciences, who are currently seeking FDA approval and EU approval for cytisine, and they're running a whole lot of sponsored preclinical and large US-based trials. So if you go to the Achieve Life Sciences, all this information about what they're doing is available there. So hopefully soon, if it got FDA approval, it may become much more available around the world. So also we wanted to know, well, is it safe? So we were doing some research about, is there anything, if it's in some New Zealand plants, we're going through all the old botany journals, trying to find out anything about whether any plants, what plants had it, what didn't. And there were a couple of papers, one here from 1923, where in New Zealand, some people had been poisoned after eating with spoons made from a tree called the kowhai. And then there was other papers around poisoning and death around if you ingested the seeds or drank any tea made with it. So it is toxic in large amounts and very similar symptoms if you had a nicotine overdose. But when used in the pills and the capsules that are marketed in Eastern Europe, there's very few side effects. They're usually mild or reversible, mainly nausea, headache, and quite similar to what you would see with NRT use to some extent, but actually more similar to varenicline in terms of side effect profile, which I'll come back to soon. So when we first found out about these papers, we cytisine, then we found some of the papers. Some of the papers were translated into English. There was a review published, and we were able to see where the gaps in the information about cytisine were. And one of the ones was there was no PK or PD data published. And so we got a PhD student in pharmacology to work with a group to set up an assay, and we started to look at the PK and PD work. So these are the papers that came out of that. So there probably was this information obviously was held with the pharmaceutical companies, probably in Eastern Europe. It was just not accessible to researchers generally. So that's why we did that work. Oops. Oh, I've just skipped myself way back. Sorry. How did I do that? Here we go. So we also were interested, well, it's a natural product, plant-based. How would people feel about that? Like, would people like that more than nicotine that's made through a pharmaceutical company? We're just sort of kind of trying to understand how acceptable this medication would be compared to other products available. And so we had some Māori and Pacific researchers do some qualitative research exploring those sort of aspects of cytisine. And our participants were able to review the product and talk about it. And here's just a quote here as an example about how that may be perceived by these different populations. Because you can have the best medication with a good side effect profile, but if it's not acceptable to people for other reasons, maybe it's got a bad taste, for instance, you would want to, it's not going to be that uptake's not going to be high. So we have done a little bit of work there too. And then we looked at looking at efficacy and effectiveness data from clinical trials. So there is review. The latest review is by Tutka and Addiction of all the evidence around the placebo-controlled trials. And so there's 8 trials. Some of them were undertaken a long time ago, 1960s to 70s, before good clinical practice guidelines came in. So the quality of the trials is probably not as good as they are now. But you can still see there's a clear treatment effect, so that cytisine is better than a placebo. So based on that information, we obtained funding from the Health Research Council of New Zealand to undertake the Cascade trial. And this was a non-inferiority trial because we wanted to say, well, if you took the current quitline care, which is combination NRT and behavioural support, what would that be like compared to cytisine plus behavioural support? So we already know cytisine is better than a placebo. So the next logical step is to have an active control. And also, it's probably unethical to run a placebo-controlled trial in New Zealand. So, we didn't think we would get that through any ethics committee. So in a non-inferiority trial, it's a slightly different research question. You're not saying something is better than the other. You're not saying drug A is better than drug B. You're trying to answer the question in this instance, is cytisine at least as good as quitline care? That was our research question. And what we found was actually that cytisine was not only at least as good as NRT, it was actually better in helping people quit smoking. And this is at all time points, but our primary outcomes always at 6 months. Cytisine also delayed time to relapse, reduced symptoms of withdrawal slightly better than NRT, and the medication compliance was higher. There were more adverse events though than standard quitline care with the NRT. So after we'd done that one, I was like, okay, well, what's the next logical place? So it's better than a placebo, better than NRT, similar to varenicline. So the logical step would be to do a comparison against varenicline, given the lower cost of the product. And so in New Zealand, we ran a trial in Māori, the Indigenous Māori and whānau of Māori, and at the same time, a trial was run in Australia called the cessation trial, and they ran their trial through quitline. And so the two references there. So these trials were running more or less in parallel, and big studies. The New Zealand study, we'd hoped for much bigger sample size, but we didn't get as high and as big as we wanted. But one of the clear findings we had was that there were fewer adverse events in the cytisine group than in the varenicline arm. And in particular, there was less nausea. And we think that's likely due to cytisine's lower potency at the 5-HT3 receptors. So you can see how we're kind of building on the research, filling in the gaps, trying to understand, what needs to happen to move the research on this topic forward. So I'm just going to give you a quick explanation about how to interpret non-inferiority trials. So this is the delta, the little triangle here, and you're looking, the line is the confidence interval, the little dot, a square in the middle, sorry, is your best guess of where you think the truth is for the result, and the line indicates, where margin of error is. So if the lower confidence interval is above the delta, then the hypothesis is met, and if it's above the 0, then the superiority hypothesis is met. So let's give it a look at an example. So here's my trial. Each of the non-inferiority trials have different specific different questions. So you need to be mindful of it when you're interpreting that. So this trial was comparing, the hypothesis was that 25 days of cytisine is at least as good as 8 weeks of NRT at 1 month follow-up. So that was our primary outcome for that one. So you can see that the confidence interval here is not crossing 0. Okay, it's not below delta of -5. So this indicates that cytisine is superior to NRT. Okay. The next trial, which is the one that we undertook in New Zealand in our Māori population, this had slightly different. So 12 weeks of cytisine is at least as good as 12 weeks of varenicline at 6 months follow-up. And our delta in this one was -10. You have to play around with the delta when you do your sample size because it affects your, so that's why it's a bit at -10 and not 5, because we just didn't have the money to do get a bigger sample size. And you can see that this time, because the line just crosses 0, it indicates that cytisine is at least as good as varenicline, but it's not superior. So just on the border there. The Australian one was different to our one. So 25 days is at least as good as 84 days of varenicline at 6-month follow-up. And this time you can see the confidence interval crosses the delta and crosses 0. So this is say it's an inconclusive finding. I think Ryan, who led the study, said if he had one more person quit, he would have got it over the line. So it's slightly difficult to interpret those types of trials, but hopefully that's helped. So what happened with the cytisine research? Well, we set up a listserv with any researchers from around the world that were interested in cytisine, just to be able to communicate with each other and say, hey, do you want some help? Do you want some information, sharing of information? And so a whole lot of other trials have been undertaken. Here's some examples. And some have not been overly clear findings, some have been much more clear, and you can see here that Achieve Life Sciences are working on their trials of cytisine, which they call cytisinicline. They've been doing phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 work as they're getting information ready for the FDA. And so, this little kernel of interest in cytisine has just kind of blossomed, and so many more people are engaging in it and exploring it. So maybe some of you might have some interest in exploring that further. So how has this research impacted the Cochrane Review? Well, the Cochrane Review on nicotinic receptor partial agonists is quite old, 2016. I know an update is pending. And only my trial is in there at the moment. So definitely made the Cochrane Review, but I'm hoping that the update will pick up all the new trials coming through. So starting to get some impact in that sense. Okay, so all this work on e-cigarettes, all this work on cytisine, what's the next place to go? So hard to think what to do next. So just to summarize, our research has shown that e-cigarettes are more effective than NRT. What I didn't tell you was that they were also more acceptable to users. Our cytisine is more effective than NRT, but I also didn't tell you, but cytisine was more acceptable than the NRT. Cytisine is at least as effective as varenicline, fewer side effects, greater acceptability. And right at the very beginning, I talked to you about our text message trials. And we have done more work in that, which I haven't talked to you about, but and we know that that's good. So the next logical step for us was to combine everything. Why don't we put these all together? And so our latest trial is called Cessation, and we are looking at combining people getting cytisine, nicotine e-cigarettes, and text-based behavioural support. So this trial is currently running. It's not, protocol's not published, but you can look at it on this clinicaltrials.gov. That's the number to search for it. So we're using standard 25 days treatment of cytisine, but we're adding a maintenance dose out to 12 weeks. That's one part of it. The e-cigarette we're using is the U-Box closed system. So this is one of the latest pod type e-cigarettes, and there's very little high quality research trials on these new pod devices. We're using a salt tobacco flavor, and they're told to use the device over 12 weeks as and when they wish. The choice of the nicotine strength and the tobacco flavor and the device is that we had some consultation with a vaping, a non-tobacco linked vaping company about their most common product that they would recommend to new users coming in. And so that's how we made that decision on what we would test. And then they get a fairly standard text message program that we have operated for many years in New Zealand. And this runs for 6 months. They get more messages at the start of the intervention and less later, and they can opt out. So the text messages start as soon as they receive a courier pack. So all the product gets couriered directly to people at no cost. Upon receipt, the courier triggers the start of this program. So, as I said, it's a 3-arm trial. You can see how it all sits. We have set a quit date of day 5 for everyone, and they have they can change one chance of changing that date if they require. And then we follow them up for 1, 3, and 6 months, also at quit date. And then we follow up a subsample out to 12 months. We can't follow everyone because we don't have enough money from our grants to follow up for that amount of time. And so really it's just a budgetary decision. So the unusual thing about this clinical trial is we use multimedia, social media advertising. Everyone comes into a website and they do their whole eligibility screening, baseline and randomization. Everything is online. And it's a very watertight system working very well, and they get told their allocation, and then within 3 days all of their product is delivered to their door, and then we just do the follow-up phone calls. The sample size is 800. So lots of outcomes, your standard smoking outcomes, but we're also looking at some cost effectiveness data as well, and also some people were told that if they want to change the nicotine strength, if they're finding it's not working for them, they're given the freedom to be able to just go and find some other strengths if they want to try it, or if it's too strong. And so we're not interfering in that process, but we're collecting information on what people do. Again, trying to be quite pragmatic. If you went into a shop and bought a device, what would you, if you didn't like the nicotine or the flavor, you might go and try something else. That's just what happens. So that's why we're allowing that to be in the trial. We're also looking at body mass index. So there's some growing evidence about the impact of e-cigarettes helping to manage weight control. But we're just, that's why we're getting some information there. The other thing is we have a very intensive adverse event data collection system, which again is a text message prompt. And people can the prompt just links them into a website where they can instantly just record any adverse events. And we're not defining those adverse events. We're allowing people just to report how they feel. Because it's an online system, a web-based, I was a bit skeptical about how well it would work, but actually it's been really good. And we used it in our e-cigarette trial with our Māori population, and most of our adverse events were reported through that system rather than through the phone call data collect, which indicates that, to me, that some of our trials are undercounting adverse events when you just do a follow-up call, because there's a lot more through this system. So currently we're halfway through recruitment. We have 404 people of our 800, so things are going really well, and we should have our results by August next year. So next steps, what to do next? So now we're looking at vaping cessation. So New Zealand's new policies are coming in. We expect a drop in smoking prevalence. We're expecting people to switch to alternative sources of nicotine as they switch away from tobacco, and that will include vapes. And so we know that there are people interested in wanting to also eventually stop vaping nicotine. Some people may not want to, but for those that do, what do we offer? And so vaping cessation is very much in its infancy. There's very little research available to guide healthcare providers. And there is a Cochrane review pending. I know that that's been registered and it's coming. And so there are some guidelines out of Canada have come out, and I think most of the advice is based on smoking cessation. So, trying NRT or varenicline like that. So there was one review by Palmer, and she identified 2 trials. One, quite a large trial in young adults, and one was a pilot study, clearly showing some impact when you are trying nicotine tapering or text-based messages. So there was some impact there, but no vapors have informed any development of any of the interventions noticed in these trials. So that's an issue. So I had a quick look on clinicaltrials.gov, and there's at least 10 other trials registered, plus the 2 I've just talked about. When you look at the sum total, the majority are what I call exploratory. So they're quite small still, probably underpowered. All of them are undertaken in the USA, and only 2 have recruited people over 30. But yet, which is fine to be focusing on youth, but what about the people that are over 30 and would eventually like to stop vaping? And so really, as these trials come through, they've registered, either underway or soon to start. For the next 2 to 3 years, we're not really going to have any definitive evidence coming through. And most of it will not be generalizable to vapers who want to quit, the majority who are over 30. And really, none of this evidence is going to really inform any policy and practice in New Zealand. So given our unique policy environment. So that's why we have shifted into focusing on a vaping cessation intervention as well, which we currently have a paper under a grant in for review at the moment for a big trial, where we will be looking at cytisine and a couple of other interventions as part of that. And Achieve Life Sciences in the States, if you look on their website, you'll see they are also undertaking some pre-work and work around vaping cessation with cytisine there too. The other area we're looking at is the issue around co-use of tobacco, alcohol, and cannabis. So how do we see the whole person and not just an individual issue with within the person? So how do we develop an intervention to address all of these things? So particularly in people that are using who are hazardous drinkers, how do we reach those populations? And so there is a little bit of evidence around the use of varenicline can also impact alcohol use, and some may also impact cannabis. So could varenicline be one medication that could help 3 things: smoking, alcohol, and cannabis use? And then if varenicline does, would cytisine. So that's another thing. So we're just kind of exploring that a little bit. The other thing is we're acutely aware that we need to consider cluster randomized trials as the ideal trial for people who smoke, mainly because people who smoke tend to also live with other people who smoke. And so when your standard way of running a clinical trial is that only the individual can come in. If you live in a household with other people who smoke, no one else in the household can be involved, because you want this nice clean trial finding. Otherwise, you might end up with 2 people in the household in the trial, but one's getting one product, one's getting another. So that doesn't sit well with me. And here's some findings from one of this is our e-cigarette trial, where almost half the people lived with another person who smoked. And in fact, this is a consistent finding across all our trials. At least 50% of people in the trials live with another person who smokes. So why am I just helping one person? And so this is why I think everyone needs to be thinking a little bit more about how do you do a cluster trial where the unit of randomization is the family or the household, probably the household. In New Zealand, our main issue is we don't have the money to run a cluster trial. They're big studies, they need more people and they need more money. And so we're just trying to figure out how we can do that. It also sits better culturally with Indigenous Maori population and other cultures to sit more at a more holistic household unit rather than the individual. So that's kind of what we're doing at the moment. I just really wanted to acknowledge our key funder is the Health Research Council of New Zealand, who have been amazing and supported this really good quality research. And we can, hopefully I've shown you that we are impacting policy and practice. We know the research is reaching into our reviews, which reach into the treatment guidelines. Also noticed some amazing people here that need to be acknowledged. Murray for his visions so early on, and Hayden McRobbie, Robin Whitaker and Anthony Rogers are others in that sense, historically have been on this journey for a long time. So that's me. I'm happy to take some questions now. Hopefully you found that of interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating and I feel like I learned a lot. All right, so we're opening now to questions. If anyone has any questions for Associate Professor Walker, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. While we're waiting for, I see there are some coming in, but I wanted to ask you, I've been reading a bit about cytisine lately, and I've been struck by, yes, the evidence on the effectiveness, lack of side effects and all of that, and very confused as to why it's not more widely available around the world. And you did briefly touch on that, but I was wondering if, because, you know, as you say, there's been trials since the 60s showing its effectiveness. So why have Western countries been so reluctant to incorporate it?
It just takes somebody to make an application. And so if you make an application for a drug to a regulatory body, you need to have all this evidence, you know, and you need to be able, you know, it's a process, and different countries have different processes, and just no one has pursued that. So in Eastern Europe, it's approved because the people over there have made that happen, but no one has just made it happen in the Western Europe. But when we looked at it, it was like, then there's gaps in the evidence. And so that's what we've had to generate, independent from any pharmaceutical company. And then the pharmaceutical companies are now, like Achieve Life Sciences as an example, are now pushing that forward. So the issue is whether the price will stay low. I don't know. As you can see, there's variability, and you see that there's opportunities for profiteering, and they're happening already. So yeah, it's a good question though. We don't understand why it's not. We did, as a group, internationally, a group of us who are interested in cytisine did put forward a case to the WHO to try and get it on the essential drugs list, but that has not been successful.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. No, well, hopefully, yes, hopefully it is a case of watch this space and it will slowly begin to find its way around.
Yep.
All right. We have a question from Claire. Do you have any reflections on approved NRT inhalators, e.g. Nicorette, versus nicotine-containing e-cigarettes for smoking cessation?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Yes, I like the mouth spray and the inhalators. I think it's about just speed of delivery. Which can an inhaler match the speed of delivery of a vape? And that's sort of understanding that. So you know, I did some work where we gave people a box of every possible NRT type of product you could find. This is pre-vapes, you know. Here's a whole box, play with them, choose which ones you want. And every time the inhaler came up as a choice. So there's that fiddle factor. Remember, you know, that hand to mouth action is really high. It's fiddle factor with it, slips in your pocket. But it was able to deliver a real good quick hit of the nicotine. And so, I quite like them. Yeah, so that's something that we have thought about doing some more work in, but we've kind of merged off, gone off another tangent to these, but I think that's a good place to go. A big area I think that needs to be focused on is relapse prevention. And so that's another area that's got very little research in it. Yeah.
No, I agree. That's definitely worthy of investigation. Then we have another question. Have any e-cigarette manufacturers sought approval to have an e-cigarette product registered for therapeutic use, brackets smoking cessation, in any jurisdiction?
I don't think so. Not that but I'm not completely across the board on that, but I don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah,
No expert on regulatory as in who's registered, but there might be somebody, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure either. All right. Those are the only questions in the chat, but I also wanted to ask you, so if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to add them. We have a few more minutes, but I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that the benefits of presenting your findings to policymakers early before it's published. And I agree that that's a fantastic idea. But as I'm sure you know, the policymakers don't always listen to the evidence, and particularly the e-cigarette area is very controversial.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any tips, particularly for the early career researchers, on how to get the policymakers to listen to the research?
Well, I think well, I can only talk about my experience in New Zealand, but you know, governments understand that there's division of thought, and often what they want to see is, well, are there any areas, like e-cigarettes, a classic one, you know, seems a bit polarized, but when you actually sit down with people with the different viewpoints, it's about like, well, what do we actually agree on? Okay, we can agree that it's probably safer than tobacco. Okay, so then the government goes, well, tell us what you agree on, and then tell us what you disagree on. And so it's just been explicit about it and say, still not sure about this, but this is basically where we agree. And but then, you know, information is always coming in, it's growing, it's always changing. So, you know, my thoughts on them have changed different as new information comes. And so people at the other end of the extreme also, you know, everyone's always moving, it's always in flux and moving around. So I just think it's about being honest with policymakers, saying, like, I try and say, well, this is our trial. These are its strengths, these are its weaknesses. We still can't answer this, but this is what it looks like. And just being honest about, you know, we just are explicit, we don't oversell it, we just say this is what we found. And you know, they're not experts in clinical trials. You have to teach them in how to interpret the information. Yeah, so that's kind of how we've managed it in New Zealand, and the majority of researchers, you know, we have found a way to come together and sometimes agree to disagree, but still also find the commonality.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. And for example, the way you explained the non-inferiority, that was the clearest explanation I've ever seen, and now I feel like I understand it a lot better.
It took me ages to figure them out. It was like they are quite complex, but yeah, I think visually sometimes it's easier to communicate what they're trying to do. And people instantly see those three trials and try and decide that they're all the same thing, but they're very different questions.
Yes.
And so understanding that difference is important.
Yes, that makes sense. All right, we have one final question. Do we have any knowledge on the use of cytisine alongside continued cigarette smoking? I understand this to be a concern with e-cigarettes as cessation and smokers continuing to smoke cigarettes alongside.
So in the trials that we do, some people will say they were on cytisine, they may continue to smoke. So the main thing is they would feel probably a bit nauseous. So because, yeah, so that would be the main thing, but we haven't picked up anything of any concern. So if people feel nauseous, we have certain advice about how to manage that. But usually it's just, yeah, it's not been a concern that's come up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think that brings us to a close. Thank you so much, Natalie, for your time and sharing your expertise with us. And we really appreciate it. and we will make this a recording available on our YouTube channel within a few days.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Okay,
All right, bye.
ka kite, bye.